Chapter 7, The War That Saved My Life. Miss Smith saw a louse in my hair that had not been there before the crowded train ride. Not that when I got it mattered to her. In a shrill voice, she insisted we take baths immediately, that minute. She said, staring at my foot, "Can you get up the stairs? What happened to you?" "Got run over by a brewer's cart," I said. Miss Smith flinched. I went up the stairs on my bottom, one at a time. Miss Smith took us into a white room with a big bath, poured hot water straight from a tap, which was fascinating, and gave us our privacy, whatever that meant. There was soap and thick towels. I took a little cloth and rubbed soap onto it and rubbed my face and neck. The cloth came away gray. I rubbed soap into Jamie's hair and my own, then turned the tap back on and rinsed it out. It was wonderful, the bath. Afterward, the dirty water ran out of the hole in the bottom of the tub instead of having to be scooped out like at home. Jamie, clean, grinned from inside a white towel. I wrapped a towel around myself and let my hair drip onto my shoulders. "Posh, this place," Jamie said. I nodded. It was a fine place. I didn't care if Miss Smith was awful. We were used to that with Ma'am. Miss Smith knocked on the door and asked us where our things were. I didn't know what she meant. We'd finished the food I brought, and I left the empty paper bag on the train. "Your other clothes," she said. "You can't possibly put what you were wearing back on." The other kids on the train had parcels, not us, I said. We're going to have to, that's all we've got." She opened the door and looked me up and down. I stuck my right foot behind my left, but it was too late. "Brewer's cart nothing," she said crossly, opening the door wider. "You've got a club foot, and you're bleeding all over the floor." She swung her hand toward me. I ducked. She froze. "I wasn't going to hit you," she said. "I was going to help you." Sure, because she was so happy to have me bleeding on her floor. She knelt and grabbed my bad foot. I tried to pull it away, but she held tight. "Interesting," she said. "King Richard III had a club foot. I'd never seen one before." I made myself think of the ponies, the pony beside the house, the pony running next to the train, me riding the yellow pony. I went away into my head and gave myself ponies, and that way I could bear Miss Smith touching me. "Right," she said. "We'll go to the doctor tomorrow, find out what we should do for you." "He won't want her," Jamie said. "Nice people hate that ugly foot." Miss Smith let out a short, harsh laugh. "You're in luck then," she said, "because I'm not a nice person at all." She was not a nice person, but she cleaned up the floor. She was not a nice person, but she bandaged my foot in a white piece of cloth and gave us 2 of her own clean shirts to wear. They hung past our knees. She combed or cut the tangles out of our hair, which took ages, and then she made us a big pan of scrambled eggs. "It's all the food I have," she said. "I haven't been shopping this week. I wasn't expecting you." All the food she had, she said, except there was butter on the slightly stale bread and sugar in the tea. The eggs looked slimy, but I was hungry enough to eat anything, and they tasted fine. When I wiped my plate with my bread, she gave me another spoonful of eggs. "What am I supposed to do with you?" she asked. It was such an odd question. "Nothing," I said. "Ada stays inside," Jamie offered. "I take care of him," I said. "You won't have to." Miss Smith frowned. "How old are you?" This question made me squirm. "Jamie's 6, I said. Ma'am said, "He's got to go to school." "He's awfully small for 6, Miss Smith said. Ma'am said, "And surely you're older than he is," she continued. "Don't you go to school?" Jamie said, "Not with that ugly foot." Miss Smith snorted. "That foot's a long way from her brain." She tapped her knife against the edge of her plate. "Birthdays, when, names, real names, not this Smith nonsense." "Ada and Jamie," I said. "Smith, that's all I know." She glared at me. I glared back. After a few moments, her gaze softened. "You really don't know." I looked at the eggs on my plate. "I asked once," I said. Ma'am said it didn't matter. Miss Smith drew in her breath. "Okay," she said. "Jamie's 6. You're older. Shall we say 9? I couldn't tell by her voice how angry she was. I shrugged. 9 was fine. I knew my numbers. 8, 9, 10. I'll write your parents, Smith said. Lady Thornton will get me their address, and I'll write them. They'll tell me. She looked us up and down. What does your father do? Nothing, I said. He's dead. Dead for years. Either that or gone. I don't know which. If I squeezed my eyes shut and concentrated, I thought I could remember him, but only sort of a blurry shadow. A tall man, quiet, not like ma'am. Oh, said Miss Smith. I'll write your mother then. Miss Smith was not a nice person, but the bed she put us in was soft and clean, with smooth, thin blankets and warm, thicker ones. She pulled the curtain across the window to shut out the light. I was so tired. Miss, I asked, whose is the pony? I had to know before I went to sleep. Miss Smith paused, her hand on the curtain. She looked out the window. His name is Butter, she said. Becky gave him to me. Who's Becky? Jamie asked, but she didn't reply. Chapter 8. In the morning we slept until the sun was halfway up the sky. Miss Smith slept late too. I could hear her snoring in the room across the hall. I took Jamie downstairs and fed him bread. I crawled again that way. I did at home. I meant to keep walking, but crawling was so much easier. The main room had a back door. Outside was a little space fenced by a stone wall, and then another much bigger space, also fenced. The pony named Butter stood in the big space facing the house, eyes and ears alert. I smiled. He looked like he was waiting for me. Jamie said, grabbing my arm, "You're not supposed to go outside." I shook him off. "That's over," I said. "Here I can go anywhere I like." He wavered. "How do you know?" It was my reward, I thought, for being brave, for walking so long, for walking away. I got to keep walking forever. I hauled myself to my feet. I would walk to the pony. I toddled and stumbled. Everything hurt. The pony watched me. When I reached the stone wall, I sat on it, swung my legs over to the other side. The pony stepped toward me, lowered his head, sniffed my hands, and pressed his neck against me. I put my arms around him. I understood how he got his name. He smelled like butter in the hot sun. I wanted to ride him, but I wasn't sure how. His back was a long way from the ground. Plus, the girl I'd seen had straps or something to hold on to. I stood, holding onto the pony's neck, and took a few cautious steps along his side. The grass in the field prickled my bare foot. The dampness felt cool on it and seeped through the bandage onto my other foot, too. The ground was soft. It moved when I stepped on it, squishy like new bread. Trees bordered the field and their tops waved in the sun. Birds twittered. I knew about birds. We had them in the lane, but I'd never heard so many at once. There were flowers. Jamie ran around the field singing to himself, whacking things with a stick he found. Butter lowered his head again, sniffing my hands. Did he think I'd brought him something? Should I have brought him something? What did ponies like? The end of his nose felt soft and warm. I traced my hand up his head to his ears and the clump of long hair between them. I rubbed his neck and he sighed and leaned into me again. Then he took a step away and went back to eating grass. I sat down in the field and watched him. He ate as though eating was his job in life, as though he was saying, "I'm not all that hungry, mate, but I've got to keep on with it. See?" He flicked his tail back and forth, then took a step, dragging himself to fresher grass. I sat and watched him, and then I lay down. I was so stiff, and the warm sun felt so nice, and I watched him, and then I fell asleep. When I woke, Miss Smith was standing over me. "You're sunburned," she said. "You've stayed out too long." I sat up, stretching. Everything ached. The skin on my bare legs had turned pink. It hurt, but I was used to things hurting. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked. She sounded cross. I blinked. I was hungry. Crashingly, achingly hungry. I was used to that too. What was I supposed to say? Did Miss Smith want me to be hungry or not? "Why didn't you wake me this morning?" she said. I'd never wake her. I wasn't stupid. "Come," she reached an arm toward me. "It's gone late. I've got to get you to the doctor, and we need to do some shopping." I don't need help," I said. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, and hauled me up. I tried to shake her off, but my foot ached so terribly that in the end I let her help me back to the house. Jamie was already inside, sitting at the table eating canned beans and toast. I slid into a chair in the kitchen. Miss Smith thumped more beans onto a plate. "Your bandage is filthy already," she said. I took a deep breath. Before I could speak, Jamie said, "I told her she wasn't supposed to go outside." "Rubbish," Miss Smith's tone was sharp. "Of course she may go outside. We just need a better system. Those shoes you were wearing yesterday." "Those were Ma'am's," I said. "I could see they weren't yours," Miss Smith said, "though I don't suppose you can wear a regular shoe." I shrugged. "Well, we'll see what the doctor says. I've hired a taxi to take us there, and then we'll come up with something. Don't get used to it. I can't afford cabs very often." I nodded, because that seemed best. It turned out that taxi and cab were both words that meant automobile. 2 rides in 2 days. Astonishing. I knew what a doctor was, though I'd never seen one before. This one had funny things like panes of round window glass stuck in front of his eyes. He wore a long white coat, like the butcher back home. "Hop on in here," he said to us, patting a big wooden table. Jamie hopped, but I couldn't. "Ah," said the doctor, noticing my foot. He lifted me onto the table. Ma'am never touched me unless it was to hit me. Jamie hugged me, but of course he never picked me up. People were all the time touching me here. I didn't like it, not at all. The doctor poked and measured and inspected Jamie and me. He made us take off our shirts, and he held a cold metal thing to our chest with tubes that ran up to his ears. He ran his hands through our hair and studied the scratchy places on our skin. "Impetigo," he said. This made no sense to me, but Miss Smith pulled a little notebook out of her purse and wrote something down. "They're pretty severely malnourished," he said. "Looks like rickets starting in the girl. Lots of sunlight for her. Good food. Milk." "But what do I do with them?" Miss Smith said. "I've never been around children." "Feed them, bathe them, make sure they get plenty of sleep," the doctor said. "They're no more difficult than puppies, really." He grinned. "Easier than horses." "The horses belong to Becky," Miss Smith snapped. "And I never had a dog." "Who's Becky?" Jamie asked. I shushed him. "And what about Ada's foot?" Miss Smith said. "What am I supposed to do about that?" I tucked my foot beneath me. Miss Smith tapped my knee. "Show him," she said. I didn't want to. I didn't want them touching me more. My foot was out of sight, bandaged, and I was managing to walk some, and I thought that ought to be enough. Miss Smith yanked my foot out. "Behave," she said. The doctor unwrapped the bandage. My, he said, cradling my foot in his hand. "An untreated club foot? I've never seen one before." "I thought club feet were rather common," said Miss Smith. "Oh, yes, certainly, but nearly always successfully resolved in infancy." Miss Smith sucked in her breath in the way I didn't understand. "But why wouldn't—" She looked at me and made her voice stop. Successfully resolved, I thought. My foot was not successfully resolved. It sounded like I'd done something wrong. Ma'am always said my foot was my fault. I always wondered whether that was true. And clubfoot. That was my foot. A clubfoot? The doctor poked at my clubfoot and twisted it and stared until I couldn't bear it anymore. I thought of Butter, how he smelled so warm and good, how his breath felt against my hand. Instead of going to an empty place in my head, now I could go where Butter was, and that was easy. "Ada," Miss Smith said loudly. "Ada, come back. Dr. Graham asked you a question." She was tapping my face. The doctor had wrapped my foot in a fresh bandage. It was over. "Are you in very much pain?" he repeated. How much was very much? What did he want me to say? I shrugged. "Did you understand what he said about seeing a specialist?" Miss Smith said. I looked at her. She looked back. "Yes or no?" she said. I shook my head. Miss Smith and the doctor exchanged glances. I felt like I'd said the wrong thing. "Dr. Graham thinks a specialist might be able to operate on your foot." I didn't know what a specialist was. I didn't know what they meant by the word operate, but I knew better than to ask questions. "Okay," I said. Miss Smith smiled. "It sounds scary, I know, but it would be a wonderful thing. I'll write to your mother right away and ask her permission. I can't imagine she'll object. Meanwhile, Dr. Graham's fetching a pair of crutches for you." Crutches were long pieces of wood you stuck under your armpits so you could walk using the crutches in one good foot. Your bad foot, if you had one, didn't have to touch the ground at all. Crutches didn't hurt. The doctor said, "See, I knew she could smile." And Miss Smith shook her head and said, I don't believe it. The doctor's place was right in town, near the train station. On crutches, I didn't need a taxi, so we walked right down the main street. I walked down the street, bad foot and all, and nobody stopped me. We went into the shops and bought meat and veggies and groceries. I went into the shops and nobody turned me out. At one point, Miss Smith said, "Ada, would you hand me 3 of those apples?" I'd been careful not to touch anything up until then, but when she asked, I figured it must be okay, and I did it, and it was. The shopkeeper didn't even look at me. The shops had so much stuff in them they gave me a jittery feeling. There was too much stuff to see, and I'd never known anyone to buy as much food as Miss Smith did, all at once. She paid for it, too, straight up with cash. Not a thing on tick. I nudged Jamie, and he nodded. Miss Smith was rich. On the sidewalk, Miss Smith counted her remaining coins and sighed. She led us into a stern-looking brick shop, and inside was just people standing behind counters. You couldn't tell what they were seeing at all. "What's this place?" Jamie asked. "It's a bank," Miss Smith said. "You've been to banks before." I didn't know why she'd think so. I'd never even heard of a place called a bank. Miss Smith scribbled on a scrap of paper and gave it to one of the men behind the counter, and he counted out money and gave it to her. "A money store?" Jamie whispered, eyes wide. I nodded. We sure didn't have one of those on our lane. We were back wearing our clothes from the day before. We couldn't have gone into town wearing only Miss Smith's shirts, but Miss Smith had washed them, so we looked and smelled nice. She marched us into a store that sold clothing anyhow, and bought us each a new set of clothes, top and bottom, and something called underwear, which she said we had to wear from now on. 3 sets of that, and stockings, and then shoes for both of us, Jamie and me. "I got shoes already," Jamie said, eyeing the stout boots Miss Smith chose. "And Ada, she don't need 'em." Miss Smith ignored him. The shopkeeper, an unpleasant man with hairy eyebrows, said, "These evacuees is nothing but trouble, isn't they, miss? My missus is that fed up already, she's wanting to send them home. Filthy little rats wet the bed." Miss Smith gave him a look and made him shut his mouth, except he begged her pardon first. And when we walked out the door, I had a brown leather shoe on my good left foot. A real shoe, for me. Miss Smith had to buy a whole pair. The man wouldn't sell her just one. She carried the other shoe in a bag. "We'll save it," she said. "Perhaps, someday." I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't ask. I was getting tired, even with the crutches, and I only wanted to think about the walk home. But Jamie danced in front of me, smiling. "If they can fix your foot," he said. "If they can fix it." I smiled back at him. Jamie was such a hopeless fool. Chapter 9. Another thing Miss Smith did was exchange her old radio batteries for charged ones. Some folks in our lanes had radios, so I knew about them, but as usual, not close up. Miss Smith sat in the main room on a glossy wood cabinet. As soon as we got home Saturday night, she put the new batteries in and started it up. Voices came out talking. Miss Smith sighed. "I wanted music," she said. She reached up and switched it off. "I suppose we'll have to hear all about the war eventually." She yawned and sat without moving. I thought of the food we'd bought. Apples, meat. I stood up. "Want me to make some tea, miss?" I asked by way of suggestion. "Cut some bread and dripping?" She frowned. "Of course not." I sat back down disappointed. I was hungry again, but then we'd already eaten twice that day. If you counted the bread we swiped in the morning. "It's nearly time for supper," Miss Smith said. She gave me a sort of smile, although like Mam's smiles, it didn't make her look happy. "I'll make supper. It's my job to take care of you." Right. But then she got up and she did make supper. A huge supper. Ham, boiled potatoes, little round green things called peas that came out of a can, tomatoes, like the ones Jamie swiped, only cut in thick slices, bread with butter, so many different colors and shapes and smells. The peas rolled around in my mouth until I bit them and they squished. Supper was like a miracle. It was. All that food all at once, and yet Jamie, worn out and cross, refused to touch anything except ham. I wanted to smack him. Hot food and meat. Miss Smith might not want us, but she was feeding us fine. Not to mention I had a shoe. That meant she didn't mind if I went outside. "Leave him," Miss Smith said tiredly when I started to tell Jamie off. To Jamie she said, You can't have second helpings of anything until you've taken one bite of everything on your plate. There had been pieces of cloth on the table folded under the forks. Before she started eating, Miss Smith had put hers on her lap, so we had too. Now Jamie took his cloth and used it to cover his head. I want ham, he said through the cloth. You may have more ham after you've tried a bite of everything, Miss Smith said. You're allowed to dislike food, but not before you've tasted it. And get that napkin off your head. Jamie hurled his plate against the wall. It shattered. Miss Smith screamed. I tackled Jamie. I grabbed a piece of tomato off the floor and mashed it between his lips. He spat at me. Eat it, I roared. I grabbed peas and shoved those down his gullet. He choked and gagged. Miss Smith yanked me loose. Ada, she said. Ada, stop it. You'll hurt him. Hurt him? When it was him disobeying? Bedtime, Jamie. Miss Smith grabbed his flailing arm. Bath, then bed. She pulled him off the floor and carried him kicking and screaming up the stairs. I'll kill him, I thought. I'll murder him for acting this way. I found my crutches and got to my feet. I picked up the broken pieces of the plate and the food scattered across the floor. I wiped up the water I spilled when I knocked over my glass. I could hear Jamie screaming upstairs. Miss Smith was either bathing him or slaughtering him. Either was fine by me. When I finished cleaning the kitchen, I climbed the stairs. Dead easy with the crutches. The screaming had stopped. I put clean water in the bath for you, Miss Smith said. Did you finish your supper? I nodded. I was still hungry, but my stomach was turning circles and I couldn't eat. There was hot water, soap, and a towel. I already felt clean, but the water was soothing. Afterward, I put on new clothes called pajamas. That was supposed to be just to sleep in. Tops and bottoms, both blue. The fabric was so soft that for a moment I held it against my face. It was all soft, this place, soft and good and frightening. At home, I knew who I was. When I went into the bedroom, Jamie was curled into a little ball, snoring, and Miss Smith was dozing in the chair beside the bed. She's not a nice person, I reminded myself, and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I jumped awake the way I did when Ma'am brought home guests. I sat up and clutched the blankets to me. My breath came in ragged gasps. Miss Smith said, It's all right, Ada. You're all right. I turned. She was still sitting in the chair beside Jamie. Moonlight came through the window. Miss Smith's face was in shadow. My heart hammered. My head whirled. You're all right, Miss Smith repeated. Did you have a nightmare? Did I? I didn't know. Jamie lay beside me, his mouth slightly open, his breathing soft and regular. Were there bombs? I asked. She shook her head. No, I didn't hear anything, but I woke up too. She held her wrist up to a patch of moonlight. It's gone 3 o'clock. I didn't mean to fall asleep here. I've slept in this chair most of the night. Somehow I could hear her smiling. I haven't slept well for a long time. Since Becky died, I don't sleep well. I asked, when did she die? Miss Smith cleared her throat. 3 years ago. 3 years ago next Tuesday. She hadn't slept well for 3 years? It's part of why I didn't want to take you, she continued. It's nothing to do with you. I'm always so much worse in the fall. And then the days get short and, well, I'm never very good in the winter either. Never was, not even when I was your age. I hate the darkness and the cold. I nodded. I hated them too. In winter, chilblains covered my hands and feet, and they itched and burned like crazy. I asked, was Becky your kid? My kid? Miss Smith gave a bark of harsh laughter. No, she was my friend, my best friend. We were at the university together. This was her house. She left it to me. And butter? I said, remembering. She gave me butter long before she died. She wanted me to like horses the way she did. It didn't take. What killed her? I asked. Pneumonia. That's a sickness in the lungs. I nodded. Talking to Miss Smith had helped my panic subside. I unclenched my hands from the blankets and lay back down. You could sleep here, I said to Miss Smith. Jamie was in the middle of the bed, so there was room on her side. She shook her head. No, well, maybe, just this once. She slid in beside Jamie and pulled the blankets over herself. I pulled my end over myself, feeling again the unexpected softness, the warmth. The next thing I knew, the room was full of light. The sound of church bells was coming through the window, open windows, and Miss Smith was saying, Oh, Jamie, you wet the bed. He never did at home. I remembered the surly salesman who complained about the evacuees' bedwetting, and I gave Jamie such a glare that he burst into tears. No matter, Miss Smith said, though she looked annoyed. It'll all wash. Monday we'll buy a rubber sheet in case it happens again. She was all the time having to buy stuff. I said, mostly to ease my worry, Of course, you're rich. Of course she was, with the posh house and all the food, not to mention a bank to hand her money. Far from it, she replied. I've been living off the sale of Becky's Hunters. She stood up, stretching. What's with the blasted bells? Have we slept that long? I suppose I should be taking you to church. That's what a decent guardian would do. She shrugged. Too late now. Downstairs she made tea. She told Jamie to put the radio on. A deep, sonorous voice came out of it, very solemn and slow. Something about it made Jamie and me listen. Miss Smith came from in the kitchen and perched on the edge of the chair. The voice said, As the Prime Minister announced just a short time ago, England and Germany are now at war. The church bells had gone silent. Jamie said, Will they bomb us now? Miss Smith nodded and said, Yes.